Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, What's in an Organic System Plan? My name is Robert Maggiani, and I am a Sustainable Ag Specialist with the National Center for Appropriate Technology, more commonly known as NCAT. NCAT is a nationwide nonprofit organization with 6 regional headquarters across the country and the central office in Butte, Montana. We work on issues pertaining to sustainable agriculture, sustainable energy, and sustainable communities. This webinar comes to you from the Southwest Regional Office located in San Antonio, Texas. Today's webinar is part of NCAT's Texas Organic Initiative, which is a long-term effort to dramatically increase the production and sales of organic produce in Texas. Major funding for today's webinar comes from the Specialty Crop Block Grant Program as administered by the Texas Department of Agriculture. We'd like to thank TDA for their support, and we are also grateful for the support from the Organic Transitions Program of USDA's National Institute of Food and Agriculture. Today's presentation will be about 45 minutes long, and we'll follow it up with time for questions from you folks who are attending. This is the second of our webinars in this series, and we welcome back all you folks who joined us last week. As you're listening, you can type in any questions you might have in the questions box on your screen, and I'll gather them up and have the speakers answer as many as we have time for when Mr. Connett finishes his presentation. Please don't hesitate to ask questions during the webinar. Chances are we won't be able to get to all of them during the webinar, but NCAT Sustainable Ag experts will get back to you about your questions by way of email in the days to come. And the next hour or so isn't the only chance you'll have to ask questions. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on NCAT's ATRA webpage. There's a feature on the page called Ask an Ag Expert where you can send us emails with any questions you might have. Or you might just call our Sustainable Ag helpline number, which is 1-800-346-9140. We welcome your questions on any sustainable ag subject, not just today's webinar topic. And it's worth mentioning that it's a free service. If you didn't get the phone number and the web address, don't worry. We'll have it on screen at the end of the webinar. Also, before we begin, I just want to remind our viewers to take a few minutes to complete the survey for today's webinar. When the webinar is over and you sign out, you'll get the survey right away. This will help us improve our webinars in the future, and we sure appreciate your taking part in it. The purpose of today's webinar is to show 2 perspectives on the same topic of creating an organic system plan. One perspective will be from a certifying agency and how their personnel apply the laws and guidelines from the National Organics Program. The other perspective will be more personal, from one farmer who has spent many years developing a multi-dimensional farming operation and how he has used becoming certified to help them become better farmers. So now I'll introduce our speakers for today. Our first speaker is Mary Ellen Holliman, who is a coordinator for organic certification at the Texas Department of Agriculture. She has served in this capacity for 5 years and was an organic certification program specialist with TDA for a year before that. Prior to relocating to Texas, Mary Ellen worked for the Alabama Department of Agriculture as an agricultural development specialist. She has a lifelong passion for agriculture due to growing up on a family farm in northeast Alabama. Their farm operations included beef cattle, range poultry, row crops, timber, various 4-H livestock projects, and over 2 acres of vegetables and orchards. Our second speaker, Skip Connett, is a co-creator of Greengate Farms in Austin and the New Farm Institute, which is the farm's nonprofit educational initiative. He grew up on a diversified row crop and vegetable farm in Pennsylvania. Prior to becoming an organic farmer in Texas, he was a journalist focusing on public health and sustainable agriculture. Most recently, he was a member of the TOFCA board, which is Texas Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association, and also was a member of the TDA Organic Agricultural Industry Advisory Board. So now I'll turn the microphone over to you, Mary Ellen. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Hello, everyone. My name is Mary Ellen Holliman, and I'll will be representing the Texas Department of Agriculture today. As Robert mentioned, I'm going to be presenting more of the nuts and bolts of the presentation. So please bear with me. I know this information can be quite overwhelming at times. My presentation goals today are to answer 3 questions. Why is the organic system plan so important? What is the organic system plan? And what information should be included in the organic system plan that you submit to your certifying agent? Which will hopefully also answer the question, why are the forms so long? Next slide. So let's get started. Why is an organic system plan important? A good organic system plan, often used as an acronym of OSP, will serve as the cornerstone of your operation. The organic system plan may be used as a template for developing your total form plan, and it can be used, and it should be used as a foundation of the certification process. A good OSP can also be used to quickly identify necessary changes that will allow your operation to adjust to climatic conditions or changes in the marketplace. Next slide. So let's move on to our next question. What is an organic system plan? The basic definition is the documentation that summarizes how your operation will obtain and then maintain compliance with the National Organic Program regulations. Next slide. However, the National Organic Program in Title VII, Part 205 of the Code of Federal Regulations, commonly referred to as the National Organic Program Regulations or the National Organic Standards, has a very specific definition, and that is a plan of management of an organic production or handling operation that has been agreed to by the producer or handler and the certifying agent, and that includes written plans concerning all aspects of agricultural production or handling described in the Act and regulations in Subpart C of this part. The Act is the Organic Foods and Cosmetic Act of 1990. And Subpart C is simply referring to a specific subpart of Title VII, Part 205, as I said, commonly referred to as the National Organic Program Regulations. Next slide. So, does it sound complicated already? Here's how the USDA National Organic Program has clarified what information must be included in the organic system plan. Next slide. As you can see, this is a lot of information and may be overwhelming, so let's simplify this by breaking down each item one by one. Next slide. So let's just go ahead and simplify. Start with the first item, which is Section 205.201A1, which states a description of practices and procedures to be performed and maintained, including the frequency with which they will be performed. So in layman's terms, you're answering 2 questions. What are you doing and how often? Be prepared to describe this information in detail. And then as far as the frequency, create a schedule for routine practices such as planting, weeding, and equipment washing, and then develop a record of specific dates for each practice that is not routinely performed. Next slide. Section 205.201A2 states a list of each substance to be used as a production or handling input, indicating its composition. This means everything you put in the soil or on the plant, and all planting medium ingredients if you do not use soil as your growing medium. This information is used to verify a lot of information. First off, certifying agents are looking that no inputs containing ingredients that are prohibited substance are applied to the land under organic management, and any input that contain restricted substances as ingredients are only used once specific requirements are met. And that's simply the definition of a restriction, is that an operation is using preventative and control methods and practices prior to using any type of restricted substance. So it's a self-implied definition. Next slide. The second part of A2 is that this listing should also identify the source, location where it will be used, and documentation of commercial availability as applicable. The source simply provides further clarification on the input for the certifying agent. The location is used to verify your operations compliance with sections 205.200 and then 205.202 through 205.207. That is very important. Let's say something happens and you accidentally apply a prohibited substance. If the certifying agent knows where that substance was applied and they have that location, it means that your operation will not have as large of an impact, a negative impact, from the application of that substance, and we can continue the certification process for the areas where the prohibited substance was not applied, and then move the areas where the product was applied into a 3-year transition period. So it takes a very rough and hard non-compliance and turns it into something that is more manageable. And then lastly, documentation of commercial availability. We must have this information in order to verify that non-organic propagation materials or ingredients were obtained and used properly. The most common times that you will see this is for seed and planting stock, as well as some processed product ingredients. But typically, commercial availability most often comes into play with seed and planting stock. Next slide. Section 205.201A3, a description of the monitoring practices and procedures to be performed and maintained, including the frequency with which they will be performed to verify that the plan is effectively implemented. So common monitoring practices used for production operations include progression of organic crops during the growing season, effectiveness of buffer zones in preventing the unintended application of a prohibited substance, effectiveness of pest, weed, and disease management plans, and effectiveness of soil fertility and crop nutrient management plans. For example, your crop rotations and the ability to increase organic matter content in your soil. Next slide. And real briefly, I want to go over handling operations as well. There's going to be 2 or 3 slides later on in the presentation, and I'm simply including this information because most vegetable and specialty crop operations soon find that once they're making a product, they're growing their operation, they soon move into the realm of having value-added products and having those value-added products being demanded by their customers. So I want to include this information, but I'm going to quickly go over it. So please, if you're interested in this information, please go back to the NCAT webinar once it's posted on the website. So real quickly, common monitoring practices used by handling operations: sourcing of organic ingredients, lot tracking, and the ability to conduct traceback activities, effectiveness of pest control and sanitation management practices. These are going to be different than what you would come across with a crop production operation. Effectiveness of prevention methods for commingling of organic product and non-organic product, and effectiveness of prevention methods for preventing organic products and ingredients from coming into contact with prohibited substances. So those are the 5 most common monitoring practices used by handling operations. Next slide. 205.201A4 states a description of the record-keeping system implemented to comply with the requirements established in section 205.103. This description should detail how your operations record keeping will fully disclose all activities and transactions in sufficient detail as to be readily understood and audited, allow records to be kept for a minimum of 5 years. Please make sure that your records are maintained for a minimum of 5 years. This is a requirement of the National Organic Program regulations, and records must be sufficient to demonstrate compliance and be available for inspection during normal business hours. I want to focus on this last item real quickly. If you have an operation where your business records are kept off-site or at a separate location, make sure that they are available to the inspector at the time of inspection, either by allowing the inspector to drive or walk within a reasonable distance to the location, or bring them on site where the inspection will actually occur. So it is very important that those records be readily available to the inspector for the inspection. Next slide. Then 205.201A5 states a description of the management practices and physical barriers established to prevent commingling of organic and non-organic products on a split operation and to prevent contact of organic production and handling operations and products with prohibited substances. For crop production, this description should detail how your operation uses buffer zones, physical boundaries, equipment cleaning, and restricted access to prevent against the accidental application of a prohibited substance on your organically managed land. For split operations, the management practices used to prevent commingling of organic and non-organic product. For those of you who may be wondering what a split operation is, this would be an operation that conducts both organic and non-organic production or handling. So let's review this item. For operations that have both organic and non-organic production and or handling, the management practices must identify how the operation prevents commingling of organic and non-organic product. Next slide. Again, if you're interested in handling, please come back once the webinar is posted on the NCAP website. Next slide. So, summary of elements in crop production. This is basically, in a nutshell, all the information that you're going to have to provide to your organic certifying agent at the time of certification or as part of your annual update process. The information is going to include your documentation on how your land requirements are being met. You should document how management practices and physical barriers prevent commingling of organic product and non-organic product. Document how management practices and physical barriers prevent contact of organic product with prohibited substances. Provide detailed information of inputs used or planned for use. That last bit, planned for use, is very key. Please always document everything that you have and or plan to use. A description of production practices and procedures, a description of monitoring practices and procedures, and of course, the description of your record-keeping system. So all of these elements should be included in your organic system plan. This next slide will be on handling. So next slide, please. Here's the information that you will need to research the USDA National Organic Program website, as well as the National Organic Program regulations. It can be found at www.ecfr.gov. And again, you're looking for Title VII, Part 205 of the Code of Federal Regulations. I also want to bring to everyone's attention at this time that the National Organic Program Cost Share, National Organic Certification Cost Share Program has come back into effect with the latest passing of the Farm Bill. And the current award period is for October 1st, 2013 through September 30th, 2014. For an operation to be eligible for the cost share program, you must be a currently certified operation that obtained or updated certification during that time period and incurred and paid certification fees. Please note that not all certification fees, those such as penalty fees, late fees, equivalency agreement fees, things of that nature will not be included as part of the reimbursement, only certification fees. Next slide. And here are some additional resources. Of course, the ATRANCAT.org website is one of our favorite websites to send people that are just getting started or are looking for additional research information. The extension.org website is moving along very well. Over the past few years, Extension has done a marvelous job of expanding their boundaries into the organic certification world. Organicseedfinder.org, please take note of this. It's a great source for locating organic seed. Omri.org is a useful source for identifying input products that are allowed for use in organic certification. And then the NRCS website. This is where you can go to find more information about the EQIP program. So you'll go to nrcs.usda.gov, click on the Programs tab, and then you'll find more information under Financial Assistance. The EQIP program is a good way to get both financial assistance as well as production experience. And then last slide, please. If you're interested in applying for organic certification through the Texas Department of Agriculture, or if you would have more information, have more questions and would like more information about our program, please feel free to contact us. Our email address is organic@texasagriculture.gov, and our telephone line is 512-936-4178. And we also have additional information and our forms available on our website at texasagriculture.gov. That concludes my presentation, and now I would like to turn the presentation over to Skip Connett with Greengate Farms.
Thank you, Marianne. I am Skip Connett from Greengate Farms, and I'm going to share the next 25 minutes or so talking about how I got into farming, why I grow organically, some of the pros and cons of certification, and then drill down into the field plan, which I think is probably the most critical and difficult part of the farm plan, and talk about how we do that. And then also talk about inspections and some of the nitty-gritties of what that's like. I want to say up front, I think it's important to say that I'm a strong supporter of certified organic, but that wasn't always the case. When we were starting up and we knew all of our customers, I didn't think I needed it. But then as we got bigger and everything got more complicated, getting certified really helped in all aspects. You know, some of what you just heard about the regs, they are kind of dry and tedious, but I just want to reiterate that this is the standard that we have. It's all we have. And without these rules, it doesn't. The organic certification doesn't stay pure and predictable, which is really needed if we're going to be able to keep it. Next slide. So today we have two certified vegetable farms. One is in Austin. It's an old historic farm. It's 3 acres. And then we rent that farm. And then we have 35 acres about 20 minutes from here in Bastrop, which we own. Both of them are very highly diversified. This is a mission of ours to farm full-time and to grow community and farmers, and also to sell food to all income levels, not just a certain segment. Our main enterprise is vegetables. We have a CSA for vegetables, and for those of you who don't know what a CSA, it's Community Supported Agriculture, and it really is a subscription service that helps us get plan and know how many customers we're going to have up front, have money up front to be able to employ people and buy seeds. and it's really the best way to go for a beginning farmer. And we also have a meat CSA, which kind of makes this a little bit different. Our other enterprises include bees, flowers, workshops, agritourism, and we do a lot of education with summer camps and farm tours. So we've been farming for 9 years, and the last 4 of them we've been certified organic. We have about 5 full-time employees at any one time, and just last year our gross income was about $250,000. I won't tell you what our net income was. Next slide. So I grew up on a gentleman's farm in Pennsylvania. It was right down the street from the Rodale Institute, which is kind of the father of organics. My mother subscribed to Rodale's Organic Gardening magazine, and we sold onions to the A&P. And this was back in the 60s when, you know, no one really talked about the organic movement. So we kind of had I was able to just walk into the A&P and sell my vegetables. But when I was 12, my parents sold the farm, but I continued to work on conventional dairy farms all through high school and college. And I really wanted to farm, but I didn't have any land. And that was about the time where everyone was saying you have to get big or get out. And so I went to college and decided to become a journalist, and eventually moved to Georgia, down to the South. And for the next 20 years, I was a reporter and started specializing in public health issues, and began to see that a lot of our health issues were influenced by our food choices, and actually the lack of food choices. And so my 2 interests were converging, writing and farming. It was still in my blood to farm, and now the local movement, food movement, was really starting to take off, and it seemed like I could actually make a living without owning hundreds of acres, and I felt like I had to do this. Few people supported my dreams. I mean, I was about to turn 50. I had a secure government job in Atlanta, and I had no cushion trust funds to fall on. Fortunately, my wife believed in me, but she said, you need to do your research. We're not going to go into this lightly. And so I spent the next 2 years reading about organic agriculture, writing about it, growing it in my backyard, and visiting Texas, where we thought we would finally come because we had family here, and Austin was a great town. It was a food town, and there was a lot of growth here. Next slide. So we moved here in 2005. I still had no land. The farming that I'd offer on fell through. Fortunately, I got a job down the street on a small organic vegetable farm, and it was the best thing that could have happened. I learned how to grow locally, what the climate was, what varieties did well here. And then an old farm came up here in Austin, and we went and decided to rent that. It wasn't for sale, so that was another good thing. We just had 3 acres, but it gave me time to learn, make my mistakes on someone else's property, and to know what we needed. So our home was also our classroom. And the CSA was a model that we started with. We had 20, 30 members, I think, the first year, and we slowly learned how to be better farmers. We also, more importantly, Erin, my wife, and I both kept our freelance writing jobs. Next slide. So we started small. Everyone said start small. On the city farm, we built a greenhouse. We raised some animals. We did a lot of reality testing about what we had either read about or seen on other farms. And slowly we started getting bigger and more customers. Next slide. We also knew from up front we wanted to be diversified, and that meant having animals. And, you know, as far as curb appeal, if you want people to come to your farm, animals win over vegetables every time. Next slide. The vegetables, that was even harder to figure out. I'd never grown in an area where you could plant and harvest year-round, and so I had become familiar with Central Texas's peculiarities, its planting and harvesting calendars, and also had to decide what kind of vegetables I wanted to grow and how to differentiate our market. So I chose some heirlooms that did well and did a lot of experimenting and kind of made it more simple because there's so many different, you can't waste a lot of time doing a lot of testing when you're trying to make a living at this. Next slide. As far as equipment, I came here with one rototiller, a handheld rototiller from the 50s, and I had to get something obviously bigger than that. And I got good advice to buy old equipment, used equipment. In this case, I went to the gray market, Japanese market, tractor, which I got for $1,500, and it's still in use 9 years later. And then as we got bigger, I went and finally did buy a new tractor that was more reliable. Next slide. So sales and marketing are just so critical. It's half of the skills and time that is required to run this kind of a farm. Our in-town farm is where our market is because it's so close to Austin. And while most of our production is at our other farm, half an hour away, it makes a good model if you can have both. It's not, renting a farm is not ideal. Having two farms and being split has its pros and cons, but I think more and more people are doing this. You've got to have this market close to the population centers, but obviously you can't do a lot of your production there. And you know, your decision whether to be certified or not is going to depend on who your customers are. Next slide. So we do a lot of intensive growing, as I said, particularly on our small farm. And then when we transitioned to a bigger farm, a lot of these practices, you know, didn't work out there. Next slide. So in 2009, after years of looking for the right land, we found some, and it happened to be on the Colorado River. And that was critical because obviously it was good soil there, but water. We were just starting to have the drought really take hold here. Wells were going dry, and we knew that if we didn't have a good source of water, you know, we might not be around 10 years from now. This land, as you can see, was real long and narrow because everyone wants a piece of the river, and it was surrounded by cattle, conventional hay, filled with mesquite. It was overgrazed. It had Johnson grass. It was everything that a vegetable farm isn't. And it took us a long time to, you know, to kind of get this land ready. But by now we had 3 years of experience, an income to show, and the USDA's Beginning Farmer Loan Program was critical right now. We couldn't get loans for raw land from traditional sources, and this is our first step into the government system, and really the most critical one. Next slide. So lots of infrastructure to consider, and all those decisions were based on, you know, that we were going to be certified organic. And so, you know, we had to decide what size fields, where would we want buffer zones. We want to have parts of the farm that were always left permanently in their native state. And so these were considerations that really let you know exactly how you're going to plan this farm out. Next slide. So scaling up, you know, now we're going from 3 acres to 35, and basically about 15 acres are in production at any one time. But you know, we had to make a decision. Do we want to, you know, have 100 acres eventually, and everyone has to go through those equations, because there are points, you know, at 5 acres, 20 acres, 100 acres where things really change. And so, you know, I was much older, and I didn't really want to be huge. I wanted to use it more for this farm for vegetables, but also for education. And I, you know, had to decide that this was kind of ideal to have, you know, 5 to 20 acres in production. And so, you know, a lot of our old equipment, this old Farmall, which I grew up driving as a kid, also is still used to do some of our cultivating. Next slide. And the same considerations with harvest and storage. You know, you can get by on 5 to 10 acres using crates and having one walk-in, but when you get to 10 acres, it becomes increasingly inefficient. And the same with your pump and your greenhouse. And so all these considerations are critical when you're getting certified too, because, you know, things get much more complicated. And if you're growing, as if you've listened to the first webcast, you know that Brenton, you know, grew very fast, and he had to really, you know, learn quickly to make all those changes. Next slide. So here we are, you know, 4 years later, and we finally got all the infrastructure in, and now we're incorporating animals into vegetables, and that's, you know, that's a real challenge. We have about 75 heritage pigs, 30 Barbados sheep at any one time, and we have cover crops at the same time, and you can really, things can get very complicated very fast. But what's great is we don't really need any off-farm fertilizer between our cover crops and our animals. And so it's not easy to do both animals and vegetables, but it is certainly, I think it makes it a more exciting experience. Next slide. Here is just an example of, you know, the different seasons, and pigs aren't easy to do on pasture in Texas. In the heat in the summer, they wanted to stay in one place and make wallows, but they do, a lot of digging and a lot of manure, and they have some benefits too. Next slide. So now the certification process. The pros and cons. I think it basically gets down to these three areas: a business decision, a values decision, and a skills decision. Do you have what it takes to pull it off? Let me say right off that I have three real strong beliefs about organic certification. First is, I think it makes you the farm and the farmer more productive. Secondly, it gets you off the fence. It makes you commit. Either you are certified or you aren't. And one of my pet peeves is a lot of people use different excuses, what I think are excuses, for not getting certified. They don't want to be part of the government, it costs too much, they can't keep records, whatever. But this is the only standard we have, and I think it's really important that you beyond organics and naturally grown other things don't really mean that much to me. So, and to give you an example of an advantage of being in the government system, is that you have all these records. Our certification records have been used to get ag exemption, to get the NRCS grants, to get other government loans, to do our taxes. So it gives you a legitimacy and some information right at your fingertips for not just your growing, but also for all other areas of the business. Some of the cons. Next slide. So, I'm sorry. One last part about the cons is that it's going to cost you time and money and frustration, and that you're going to lose some of the freedoms that you have. For example, our NRCS cover crop grant, it requires 5 species in our cover crops, and I've gotten away and found it was just fine doing 3. But now, I have a contract to grow their way, and I have to do that. So the field plan. This is really your field histories, and this is where everything comes together. This is the beginning and the end of all these factors and influences of the organic farm, where they come together, and the how, what, and where to implement your practices, and also how to determine your effectiveness. And how you do that. Everyone has their own kind of recording record devices. We use Excel spreadsheets, and we also use hand, notebooks with paper on them in the greenhouse and out in the fields. And then when we come in the office, we put them in Excel spreadsheets that have all these different columns that we can have a really good map of where things are, but also literally maps with each field and some of the detailed information that will help you to know what you're doing, when and where, in an efficient manner. I can't reiterate this more. You've got to know your farm really well, and you have to have some experience on that farm before you can start making this happen effectively. And that's a constant learning process, and I've still got years and years to go. And next slide. So the field plan, also, there's some factors you got to put in here. What are you growing? If you're growing 2 or 3 crops once a year, that's very different than if you're doing 50 to 100 varieties. You're growing them twice a year. Here in Texas, we grow year round, and so we've got. I'm planting tomatoes in the spring, but also in the fall, and you can imagine how that complicates the rotation process. And then you add covers, crops, and animals, and like I said, it can be a nightmare if you don't have a good map and plan. So these rotations, which are critical, a whole part of the organic process, you've got to look ahead a couple years at least, and these will change depending on the weather and the pest and weed pressure and even the markets. But you at least have to have an ideal and a goal, and it will certainly change. You also have to become familiar with the optimal planting and harvest dates, what family vegetables should follow each other in terms of soil health and pests and weed control, and then the same cover crops. When do you plant them? When do you plow them down and kill them? And how much nitrogen do they provide? And when do you get soil tests and so on? And then finally, there needs to be fallow periods. Everything needs a rest, including your fields. And you have to, ideally, every other year, it's nice to have a field that just stays there and does nothing other than recover, but that sometimes doesn't happen, particularly when you're small or starting out. Next slide. So inputs. You know, as Marilyn said, all of your inputs have to meet the NOP standards. They have to be recorded. You have to be able to tell, well, okay, what did I do in this field on this month? And there's a lot of good information you can get from that too. But I think what's important is that you are going to have to know exactly what the rules are. And cover crops, for example, it's hard to get certified organic cover crops in large quantities, and maybe particularly for your part of the country. The only way you could not get organic seed for cover crops is if you can't get the quantity you need, or maybe the varieties that don't do well in your area. So you have to do a lot of looking around, talking to other farmers, so you can find that seed. It's going to cost a lot more. There's no way around that. But we're working together with other farmers sometimes to aggregate orders, and we can cut our shipping costs. So that's another example where cooperation can really help you. And the same goes with nutrient management and pest and disease control. Any inputs that go in there for those purposes have to be follow the standards. If you're putting in more nitrogen or phosphorus, it has to be allowable. And the amounts and the application rates and the times have to be recorded, and this can be tedious. So you've got to get into this habit of constantly carrying notebooks around and making sure you go back in the office and put them in. Because things, as you know, in farming, get so out of control so quickly. Just to give you an example, we'd sometimes have to supplement our nitrogen with feather meal. And so I go load up my truck and go to this chicken processing plant, and they have these big silos, and they pour it in, and they have lab results. They take a little sample of that, and I have to take those results and have them in my records, and it has to be our inspector will figure out if this is natural and any additives in there, and if that passes, and so on. So anytime you go outside of your farm, you've got to record that. Next slide. So the same thing with the outputs, the harvest. As Mary Ellen said, there's the requirements and regulations for harvesting have become more rigorous because of outbreaks, and there's a lot of controversy about that, particularly among smaller farmers. But at basic, you've got to be able to track all your harvests. And it's really hard for a CSA to track. We don't have big lots and big harvests all at once. We're harvesting out there every day, and so we use our CSA records, which show exactly what came out of each field each day, and that's acceptable by our certifiers for us to be able to track if, God willing, it never happens, but if there was some contamination, that we could go right to our records and identify it. So, but these harvest records also really help you know what your harvests are. Something like potatoes, if you do an acre, you can go back and say, well, this didn't do as well as I thought it did. I might try another field or whatever. Next slide. So, and the last area is the hoop house. We just, through the NRCS grant, and I think almost all the states now, at least about 40 of them, have this available through the EQIP program, and this is to extend your seasons, and we were able to apply and get this hoop house built, and for the first year we grew tomatoes in it, but it was new for us, and so we had to, it's a little microcosm of the farm, but it has its own set of different problems, and we use a different variety of seeds because it's stationary and covered. It has different challenges, so you need separate records for your hoop house. And the NRCS requires these records in addition to our organic certifier. So there's just they overlap, and it's usually the same information, which is nice. So anyway, finally, next slide. The inspectors and the inspections, some factors to consider. There's state agencies and there's third parties. And we had to consider a couple things. One, when we were getting certified, wanted to get certified, TDA had a 6-month waiting period. And so we decided to go with a third party. and this person is, on the other side of the country, but fortunately he did a lot of inspections here, and it costs more, but we felt like it was more personalized and more convenient. So, there are things to consider there. As far as, at inspection time, do you decide to do it versus someone else? And for the first 3 or 4 years, I had to do it because no one on my staff I felt was, had the big picture and could do it. And it's also a very intense, experience, particularly your first or second time. And so, I've never been really great at organizing, and so I had an employee who loved it, and that was a real relief. And for the first time, I was actually able to just sit at the side and watch her take the lead on it. The inspection, as I said, is intense. It's nerve-wracking in the beginning. And I'll just give you an example. Our first year, we had a lot of we've gone to a lot of conferences over the year, and they always have samples of stuff that they're selling, whether it's composts or different inputs, and we rarely ever use these things, and we'd stick them in our equipment building, and they left them there, and they're gathering dust. But when our inspector came, he started pulling them down off the shelf, and he wanted to know exactly what was in every ingredient was used in each of these products, and we had to do all this research, and it held it up by weeks, and we weren't even using these. And so it's good to really know that everything on your farm is up for grabs in terms of going through the inspection process. So finally, the last slide is about, next slide, resources. Can you go back one? Thanks. There's, when you're farming, you have such little time to read and go to conferences, but if I had to choose one book right now, I would go with Farmers with a Future, and it was published by Chelsea Press like 2 years ago, and this is a woman who was a pig farmer in California, organic, and stopped after 9 years, went around the country with her husband and visited a lot of farms that she thought were really, doing some innovative stuff, and she features them, but she goes through all A to Z of what is required to make it in today's world of small sustainable farming. And then the conferences, there's some great ones, but one that really sticks out in our region is Southern SAWG. The Southern Agriculture Working Group has an annual conference. Sometimes it's in, it changes each 3 or 4 years. I think right now it's in Alabama, but it was in Arkansas. And you have 1,000 farmers there who will come together, and it's just a really informative conference. Organizations, Robert mentioned TOFCA. It's kind of equivalent in Maine is MOFCA. They've been around a lot longer. They're much bigger, and they've got some really great resources. And then I mentioned the Rodale Institute in Pennsylvania, and then APTRA, which is NCAT. That had a great source of free information back before the internet, and it was just critical to have that. And then, of course, going to other farms, you can't beat that. A lot of farms have tours, we do, and then you have newsletters that those farms put out. And then the last slide is, I hope some of you have heard of Holistic Management International, HMI, but they have a great program and kind of exercises and a way of looking at your whole farm through all the different aspects, not just business-wise, but meaning, your values and so forth. And my wife went through that program, and it really changed the way we look at the farm. And to me, it's kind of after you've been farming for a while, sometimes you go back and you look at these things in a new way. So that's it. I wanted to leave with one last thing, and that was yesterday I was mowing down my cover crops. It was 100 degrees out there, and it was kind of miserable because there was bugs, mainly grasshoppers, flying out in my face and everywhere. And that's a result of being certified organic. You have bugs. But then I looked up above me, and there was dozens of swallows following me, swooping through the air and eating those bugs. And no bugs, no birds. And to me, it's all that diversity that really is the bottom line of why I'm doing this. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Skip. That was an interesting way to end your presentation there, and I'm sure it really resonates with everybody listening about how important it is to pay attention to the environment that you're really working in. We do have some questions that have popped up on the questions pane. The first one is going to be addressed to you, Mary Ellen. I'd like maybe a little bit more detail. You mentioned about the fact that the cost share program has now been reinstituted, and I'm curious if you could give us some of the dollar attributes, I guess. What percent is going to be cost shared, or how much, what's the maximum dollar, that kind of thing?
Absolutely. So the cost share program is for 75% of your certification fees up to a maximum of $750 per scope of certification.
Okay, so if someone's fee was only $500, they couldn't get all $500 back.
Correct. They would get 75% of that $500 certification fee.
Okay, thank you. Another one for you, Mary Ellen, relates to the certifying agent. We know that you represent TDA, but there are other agents that are allowed to certify in Texas. Skip mentioned it also in his presentation. So basically the questions were, how and when do you get involved in choosing a certifying agent? What sort of comments would you have for that? And I'd like to hear both of y'all response to that.
Absolutely. So I don't recommend a all-in-one approach. Everyone should have come to TDA for certification. Let me just go ahead and put that out there. We provide the same service as all other certifying agents as far as providing an operation the ability to become certified organic. But as with most government certifying agents, we have limited resources, and our ability to provide additional services are going to be limited. For example, if somebody needs quick access to a consultant, we're not going to be able to help in that regard. We're going to have to send them out to the internet, out to ATRA, out to a couple of other organizations, and they'll have to conduct that research and identify the best consultant for themselves. Private certifying agents have the freedom to market consultants where we do not. Another common issue is operations that want to get involved in the organic movement, become a voice, a lobbyist for the organic movement. As a government agent, we cannot be involved in that aspect whatsoever. So if someone is passionate and they want to get into that, a government certifying agent such as TDA would not best serve their needs. Also, as Skip mentioned, cost. That is where a government certifying agent is probably going to be the better choice. If you are looking at just entering the market and you need a lower cost certifying agent, that is when the government certifying agents are going to be a good decision. We do provide some of the lowest fees in the nation, but with low fees, again, comes low resources. So be prepared for a longer certification process. Please understand that we may not be able to send an inspector out next week to get you certified. So be prepared for a longer certification process. Be prepared for forms that may be PDF but not writable. You may be allowed to submit some things through email and online, but you can't submit everything. So there are pros and cons, and that should be considered part of your business decision to go organic. In reference to the second part of that question, when to choose a certifying agent, I recommend operations make that decision as soon as possible. It will help alleviate the stress of trying to figure out what information is going to be needed in that organic system plan, because they can say, okay, I'm going with XYZ certification services. Let me go pull up their organic system plan forms, and I can start managing my record keeping and managing my tracking logs in a manner that will easily transition over into these forms and this documentation. So Skip, do you have anything that you want to add?
No, just that with a third party, at least ours, you have to pay a proportion of your gross sales, and so you know, depending, that can add up. And as you said, it is more expensive, and that's one of the reasons. They usually don't just have flat fees, but they want a percentage. It's very small. In our case, it's 0.5%. And so, you know, that's a lot to consider.
Okay, thank you, Skip. We have another interesting question here. Someone has just started a new small farm on a piece of ground that hadn't been farmed in over 30 years. And her question is, and I'm going to pose it to you, Skip, should we wait a few years to start the organic certification process or begin it now?
Well, I would begin it now without getting certified, and do all those practices that you would be required to if you're certified. But it's, first of all, you've got to find out, you know, it hasn't been farmed in 30 years, but does that mean no one's been on there in any shape or form? Can the owner, previous owners, is going to have to fill out a form saying nothing's been done on this farm, any kind of chemicals or anything that would make it prohibitive in the last 3 years? So if you've got that, then you're clear. You got a clean slate. And then I would, if you're not ready in terms of your skill, record keeping or whatever, then at least I would do everything that you're needed to do, and then maybe wait, you know, a year or two until you're ready, until it makes a lot of sense economically to do it.
Okay, thank you, Skip. Here's another one that's come in for you. That's a really specific question, Skip, and it's how do you control fire ants in the okra? That's a really specific question.
Wow, I don't. Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, they've never been that bad, and I don't know why exactly. I know they're in there, and sometimes it's just a matter of skipping over that plant. I've never had them get out of control to the point where I lose. I didn't think anything could ever kill okra, including the heat and the drought, and so I don't think fire ants can either. But I don't have the answer to that.
All right, thank you. Here's one I'm going to pose to you, Mary Ellen. The question reads, what are the land requirements that need to be documented?
Oh, okay, so that is 205.200, which is the general management and improvement of soil and water quality, and 205.202, which is the land requirements. So I definitely want to state first and foremost, best way to answer that question is to go to Title 7, Part 205, Section 205.202. That will tell you what the requirements are. But as a quick summary, as Skip mentioned in one of the previous questions, there must be documentation that the 3-year, also referred to as the 36-month transition period, has been completed or is in the process of being completed. That means 3 years without any prohibited substance being applied to the land. Doesn't necessarily mean that the management practices have to be compliant, but the inputs actually applied to the land must be compliant. Second thing is identification that the operation has sufficient boundary lines and buffer zones, and that's where some of the gray area for the certification requirements comes in, is that there's not a specific boundary line and buffer zone. A lot of people come to me and say, Mary Ellen, I have a 50-acre parcel that I'm going to be putting in vegetables. How big of a buffer zone do I need? Well, I can't answer that question. There's going to be a lot of variables because buffer zones are specific to each operation. Even in the same field, you may have different size and different location buffer zones according to various factors such as wind direction, average wind speeds, the adjoining land use, things of that nature. So be prepared to have documentation of all of that information. I'd make sure that you identify if you have any type of riparian areas or waterways that you have taken steps and procedures to protect that water quality. That's probably one of the least common records that we come across, but it is very important as far as documenting your land requirements.
All right, thank you, Mary Ellen. Skip, I have another question that relates to your NRCS hoop house process. Can you give us your comments on how difficult that was, how long did it take, and how does that really work in with being certified organic?
Well, from my understanding, it's part of the incentive for those who were trying to transition to organic. I think you get a higher score when you apply. The application was very simple, but that might have been simple for me because I had all this information. But they're going to want to know, you know, how you're making a living, what your income is, and that you're a serious full-time, or at least, you know, farmer who's been doing this for a while. Texas just got it 2 years ago, so there was a lot of built-up competition, or, you know, people waiting to get onto that. And but I think each county gets a pot of money, and they decide, you know, how they're going to disperse that. And there's only one other certified organic farmer in Bastrop County, and so I was very lucky to I had kind of a head start, an advantage above all those other farmers who weren't certified. So that's really, I think, it's a good example of how some of these things overlap and enhance each other. But I would encourage you to do it. There are some requirements that you need to know about. You can't do anything with this hoop house for 3 years. You can't heat it, put electricity, and so it's just to extend your season at both ends. And after those 3 years, you can do what you want, but there are some requirements.
All right, thank you, Skip. We have another question that came in from way down South Texas. This is addressed to you, Mary Ellen. Is it possible to complete the certification process this month and participate in the cost share program with TDA?
Oh, gracious. That would have to be one amazing application, let me tell you. When I was talking at the first of the presentation, answering that question of why are the forms so long, our land producer organic system plan form, I believe, is 29 pages. So if an operation came in today, submitted their application, and then, let's see, that would be tough. At least going through the TDA. There are other certifying agents that charge expedite fees. TDA does not offer that, but there are other certifying agents that do provide that service. Now, those expedite fees are typically on a per case basis, so they are not published, and I can't say CCOF charges $2,000 for an expedite because I simply don't know. Most certifying agents that do provide that expedite fee do it on a per basis, per case basis, and I don't know what that fee matrix is. But to answer the general question, yes, it can be done, but you are going to have to be diligent about it, and your choice of certifying agent needs to be made today. Quite frankly, you need to be getting on the internet, going to the National Organic Program webpage, looking at certifying agents that provide services in the state of Texas, identify those certifying agents that provide expedite services, and then base your decision for a certifying agent off of that, because going through TDA, I can't guarantee you that you would obtain certification by the end of September.
All right. Thank you, Mary Ellen. I believe we have time for one more question. Skip, I'm going to address this one to you. And the question is about, are there any good record-keeping systems that really are geared toward organic producers that somebody could just buy? In other words, they're public public system, or you can just go and buy it, that really are geared towards organic producers that you know of?
You know, our main operation is a CSA, and so we have a thing called Pharmago, which is software that does a lot of the behind-the-scenes record keeping for customers and our harvesting and all that, but that doesn't cover everything. I don't know of a system that does. Nothing beats, you know, an Excel program, and if you can find a system that allows you to cover everything, I haven't found it, but I do think, you know, the best place to go is to your certifier. They have, and our certifier has all these forms, all on their websites that you download, and you know, some of them you can do on the computer. You know, they're active PDFs, and but I don't think there's any kind of easy way to do this. Now there is, you know, develop your own software for your field plans and all that stuff, and Brenton's done a great job of doing that at JBG Organics, and he mentions that in this previous talk. But I am not aware of a single kind of program that can cover all the bases, because you're having to buy seeds, and you've got to, you know, put down, you've got to document, you've made 3 calls to different seed companies and what was the response. I don't think any kind of software is going to help you do that.
All right, thank you, Skip. And again, I want to thank both of you all for helping us present kind of the two sides of the same coin of creating a farm organic system plan.
Thank you.
I want to thank all of the people who are attending. I'd like to remind you quickly, don't forget to do the survey for us. We really appreciate it. It's going to be helpful to us. And with that, I guess we'll sign off. Thanks to both of y'all.
Thank you.